There is a specific kind of knowledge that most people spend their entire lives carefully avoiding. Not because it's difficult to find, not because it requires special education or rare intelligence, but because encountering it honestly, really sitting with it, without immediately reaching for a distraction or a comfortable counter-argument, changes something in you that cannot be changed back. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's exactly why most people don't look. What separates the small fraction of people who genuinely understand how the world works from the vast majority who operate inside comfortable illusions isn't intelligence. It isn't access to secret information. It isn't some special gift that was given to a few and withheld from others. It's something much simpler and much more demanding than any of those things. The willingness to follow a thought all the way to where it actually leads, even when where it leads is frightening. Most people stop thinking just before that point. They get close, sense the discomfort ahead, and turn back towards something more manageable. They tell themselves they've thought it through. They haven't. They've thought up to the edge and retreated, and called the retreat wisdom. Today we're going to walk past that edge, not to be provocative, not to perform intellectual courage, but because the questions that live on the other side of that discomfort are the ones that actually matter. And because the number of people willing to ask them honestly may determine the shape of the world we're all about to inhabit. The comfortable story and what it costs. Every society tells itself a story about how it works. Not an explicit story, not one written down anywhere and debated openly, but a background narrative so pervasive and so consistently reinforced that most people inside it never consciously register that it's a story at all. It simply feels like reality. The dominant story of modern societies, particularly in the industrialized world, goes roughly like this. We live in systems that for all their imperfections broadly reward merit, roughly reflect the preferences of the people inside them, and are gradually improving through the accumulated efforts of well-intentioned individuals and institutions. Progress is real. Problems are real but solvable. The future will be better than the present, more or less, if we keep doing roughly what we're doing. This story is not entirely false. There are elements of it that reflect genuine truths. Progress is real in many domains. Many institutions do reflect genuine effort toward genuine goods. The picture isn't uniformly dark. But the story, taken as a whole, is profoundly incomplete. And its incompleteness is not accidental. The gaps in it serve specific interests, and those interests have considerable resources devoted to keeping the gaps invisible. Understanding which parts of the story are missing and why is the beginning of actually understanding how the world works. The 1% who truly grasp this aren't cynics. They're not conspiracy theorists, not nihilists, not people who've concluded that nothing matters because everything is corrupt. There's something more difficult to categorize and more genuinely threatening to the systems they've come to understand. There are people who see clearly, who refuse comfortable simplifications, and who have developed the rare capacity to hold complex, uncomfortable truth without needing to immediately convert it into something more manageable. The first truth: systems are not designed to serve you. The first thing that most people never fully allow themselves to understand is this: The large systems that shape their daily lives, economic systems, political systems, media systems, educational systems, were not primarily designed with their well-being in mind and do not primarily operate with their well-being as their central objective. This sounds harsh, stated that plainly. It sounds like the beginning of a cynical worldview that leads nowhere useful. But follow it carefully, because what it actually reveals is more nuanced and more important than a simple claim that everything is corrupt. Systems develop according to incentives. The incentives built into a system determine what the system rewards, what it amplifies, what it produces more of. The most significant transformations in human experience tend to arrive not as loud announcements, but as quiet accumulations, dozens of small changes that seem manageable in isolation until the day they converge into something no one can any longer pretend is normal. That day is closer than most people think. This isn't speculation dressed up as prophecy. It's a pattern that repeats across the full length of human history. And right now, for the first time in centuries, multiple fundamental forces are shifting simultaneously. The question isn't whether the world you know is changing. It's whether you understand clearly enough what's actually happening to make real choices inside it, or whether you'll simply wake up one day inside a world that arrived without your permission. We've been here before, but never quite like this. To understand what's coming, we need to understand what's already passed. Humanity has lived through genuine civilizational turning points before. Moments when the basic rules of existence rewrote themselves so completely that people on opposite sides of the threshold could barely comprehend each other's lives. The agricultural revolution, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, was one such moment. Before it, human beings lived as nomadic foragers, small mobile groups following food across landscapes, carrying everything they owned, answering to the immediate demands of survival. After it, people settled. They built permanent structures, accumulated possessions, developed hierarchies, created the earliest forms of what we'd eventually call states and economies and religions. The world before that threshold and the world after it were not different versions of the same thing. They were different things entirely. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in the 18th century, was another such threshold. Before it, the overwhelming majority of human beings worked with their hands, lived where they were born, and organized their lives around cycles of season and community that had remained essentially unchanged for millennia. After it, people poured into cities, worked inside machines rather than alongside animals, and found themselves inside economic and social structures that their grandparents would have found completely incomprehensible. Each of these transformations shared a specific pattern. First, the changes seemed merely technical: new tools, new methods, modest improvements on what already existed. Then, gradually but irreversibly, those technical changes began hollowing out the deeper structures of daily life. How people worked, where they lived, who they loved, what they believed, and what they understood themselves to be. By the time most people recognized what had happened, they were already living inside the new world. The old one was gone. We are inside that same pattern right now, and we are closer to the threshold than most people are prepared to admit. The three forces converging. What makes this moment different from ordinary periods of change, what makes it genuinely comparable to the agricultural and industrial revolutions, rather than just another decade of technological progress, is that three separate fundamental forces are shifting at the same time. Each one alone would be enough to reshape the world significantly. Together, they are creating a convergence that points to a specific period, the years we are living through right now and the ones immediately ahead, as the actual turning point. The first is the transfer of cognitive authority from human minds to algorithmic systems. The second is the dissolution of the boundary between real experience and synthetic experience. The third is the beginning of the end of individual cognitive isolation, the earliest stages of minds connecting to other minds and to external systems in ways that go beyond anything a smartphone or a screen can offer. Let's take each one seriously, because each one deserves more than a headline. When machines start making the decisions. Right now, at this exact moment, algorithms are making consequential decisions about your life. What information reaches you? What opportunities surface in front of you? What risks you're assessed as carrying? In many countries, algorithmic systems are already involved in decisions about who gets a loan, who gets flagged for additional scrutiny at a border, who gets shortlisted for a job interview, and which neighborhoods receive which resources. Most people experience this as a background hum, mildly annoying when it's visible, invisible the rest of the time. But the scale and depth of this transfer is accelerating rapidly. The systems making these assessments are becoming more capable, more integrated into more domains, and more trusted, or at least more relied upon by the institutions that deploy them. The question this raises isn't simply a technical one, it's a philosophical one, and it's urgent. What happens to human agency, human judgment, and human identity when the cognitive functions we've always associated with being a person, evaluating, deciding, choosing, predicting, increasingly happen outside of us? There's a version of this future that looks genuinely appealing. Systems that process more information than any individual could ever absorb, that don't get tired or emotionally reactive, that optimize across long time horizons without being distracted by short-term comfort, these could, at least in principle, help people live better lives. The doctor who uses an AI diagnostic system that catches patterns a human eye would miss. The city planner whose decisions are informed by models complex enough to predict ripple effects across transportation, housing, and public health simultaneously. The individual whose personal financial decisions are guided by a system that actually understands their long-term interests better than their impulsive present-moment self. But there's another version of this future that's harder to look at directly. A world in which the gradual outsourcing of judgment produces people who have lost the practice of genuine autonomous thought, in which the systems doing the deciding are optimizing for objectives that serve institutional interests rather than individual well-being, in which the sheer convenience of deferring to a machine slowly erodes the capacity and eventually the desire to make real choices at all. We are not yet at that endpoint, but we are moving toward it, and the movement is accelerating. By the time this shift becomes fully visible to most people, most of the meaningful decisions will already have been made. A pause worth taking. I want to stop here and ask you something directly. When you think about the decisions that shape your daily life, what you read, what you buy, how you spend your attention, who you interact with, How many of those decisions do you believe are genuinely your own? How many of them happen because something, somewhere, learned your patterns well enough to steer you without your noticing? This isn't a comfortable question. Most of us prefer to believe in our own autonomy. But discomfort with a question isn't evidence that the question is wrong. If any part of this is landing for you, if you felt, even fleetingly, that your choices are somehow less free than they feel, share that in the comments. You're almost certainly not the only one. When real stops meaning what it used to. The second force converging on this moment is perhaps the most disorienting of the three, because it strikes at something most of us have never had reason to question: the basic reliability of our own experience. For all of human history until approximately now, there was a meaningful distinction between what actually happened and what was represented, imagined, or fabricated. A story was a story. A painting was a painting. A memory, whatever its distortions, pointed back to something that had actually occurred. That distinction, real versus represented, has been foundational to how human beings relate to truth, to each other, and to themselves. That distinction is dissolving. The generation of children growing up right now is the first in human history for whom creating a convincing synthetic experience is easier, cheaper, and more accessible than documenting a real one. A child today can produce video of herself in a place she has never been, having a conversation she never had, with a person she has never met, and the result is indistinguishable from footage of something that actually happened. This is still, for most adults, a novelty. We are still oriented toward real experience as the baseline and synthetic experience as a departure from it. But the children growing up inside these tools have no particular reason to share that orientation. For them, the interesting question may not be, did this actually happen, but what did this mean, and what did it feel like? And as the fidelity of synthetic experience continues to increase, across more senses, with greater emotional depth, with the capacity to create not just images and sounds, but the full texture of felt experience, that reorientation is going to spread well beyond children. Consider what this actually means. It means that the felt experience of grief over a loss, the felt experience of joy at an achievement, the felt experience of intimacy with another person, all of these, which we have always understood as anchored to real events and real relationships, will increasingly be producible without those anchors. The grief at the loss of someone who died can be met and perhaps transformed by a conversation with a synthetic version of that person that feels entirely real. The longing for an experience you never had can be met by a memory of it that your own brain cannot distinguish from something that actually occurred. This is going to force questions that our current frameworks are not equipped to answer. If a synthetic experience produces the same emotional learning, the same personal growth, the same lasting change in how a person understands themselves and the world, in what sense is it less valid than a real one? What do concepts like authenticity, truth, and genuine connection actually mean when the line between real and manufactured has become impossible to locate? These aren't hypothetical philosophical puzzles. They are practical questions that millions of people are going to face in the years immediately ahead. And we have almost no shared framework for answering them. The beginning of something older than language. The third force is the one that gets talked about least, partly because it's the hardest to explain without sounding like science fiction. and partly because its early manifestations are easy to dismiss as marginal technology stories rather than civilizational shifts. But the earliest stages of direct neural interface technology, the ability to connect a human mind more directly to external information systems and potentially to other human minds, represent something genuinely unprecedented in the history of our species. Not a new tool, like a wheel or a printing press or a computer. Not even a new medium, like language or writing. Something closer to a new mode of being conscious. Language allowed human minds to share structured thought across distance and time. Writing allowed that sharing to persist beyond the moment of speech. Digital networks allowed it to happen instantaneously across the entire planet. But all of these involved a fundamental translation, a conversion of inner experience into a symbol, and a conversion back from that symbol into inner experience on the other side. The gap between minds remained. The translation always lost something. What neural interface technology points toward, in its earliest, crudest current forms, and much more clearly in the direction it's developing, is the possibility of reducing that gap. Not eliminating individual consciousness, not merging people into some undifferentiated collective, but creating new possibilities for shared experience that have simply never existed before. The ability to convey not just the content of a feeling, but something closer to the feeling itself. To share not just the conclusion of a thought, but the texture of arriving at it. We are nowhere near the mature version of this, but the direction is clear, and the pace of development is accelerating. Within the time frame most of us will live to see, some version of this will be real enough to matter. And when it is, it will change what intimacy means, what collaboration means, what identity means, in ways that are genuinely difficult to think through from inside the world we currently inhabit. What this means in practice. So, what does any of this actually mean for the life you're living right now? It means the skills, assumptions, and frameworks that have served most people well up to this point are becoming progressively less reliable guides to the future. Not useless, the fundamentals of human psychology, of ethical reasoning, of meaningful relationship don't simply evaporate because the environment around them changes. But the context those fundamentals operate inside is shifting rapidly. And navigating that shift requires a different kind of attention than most of us were trained to develop. It means that the questions worth spending time on are changing. Not how do I perform well inside the existing systems, but which of the existing systems are worth participating in, on what terms, and at what cost to what I actually value. Not how do I keep up with technological change, but what does it mean to remain genuinely human inside technological change, and what does that even mean? It means that the people who will navigate this transition well are not necessarily the ones who adapt fastest to every new tool or platform. They are the ones who maintain enough clarity about their own values and enough honest awareness of what's actually happening around them to make real choices, rather than simply drifting inside whatever current is strongest. And it means that the window for developing that kind of clarity, before the changes become so pervasive that navigating them consciously requires enormous effort, is open now and not indefinitely. The time that's left. There's a specific quality to living inside a historical turning point that most accounts of such moments fail to capture. The way ordinary life continues. The way the routines and small concerns and daily textures of existence carry on, unchanged in their surface appearance, even as something fundamental shifts beneath them. The people who lived through previous civilizational thresholds didn't experience them as dramatic ruptures for the most part. They experienced them as a gradual accumulation of strangeness, familiar things that no longer quite worked the way they used to, new things that seemed unimportant until suddenly they were everywhere, and a persistent sense that the world they'd been taught to understand was becoming less and less legible. That's the experience most of us are having right now, if we're honest about it. And the choice in front of us isn't whether this transition happens. It is happening, with or without our understanding or consent. The choice is whether we meet it with awareness or with avoidance. Whether we think through what we actually value before the options narrow, or wait until the moment has passed and the new world simply is. The world you know is living on borrowed time. That's not a cause for despair, it's a cause for the kind of clear-eyed attention that turning points demand. The people who came through previous thresholds with their humanity intact weren't the ones who pretended nothing was changing. They were the ones who understood what was changing clearly enough to decide, deliberately, what they were going to carry through and what they were willing to leave behind. That work belongs to all of us, right now, in the time that's left. If this is something you find yourself thinking about, the feeling that something large is shifting, that the familiar world is becoming less legible, that the questions everyone else seems comfortable ignoring are actually the ones that matter most, you're not wrong. And you're not alone. Share what's on your mind in the comments. The conversation that happens there matters, and it might matter more than it seems. Subscribe if this kind of reflection is worth more of your time. We'll keep meeting here, working through the questions that define this specific, extraordinary, irreversible moment in history.